October 1923. The Carpathian Highlands above the Tisa headwaters. The foreman's name was Grus, and he did not look back. They loaded the last mule with what remained, salt pork, lamp oil, a half sack of rye flour, and started down the switchback trail while the first real frost clung to the grass like powdered glass. "Walk down before dark," Grus had said, not unkindly. "The caravan will be back by Thursday. If not, follow the creek to Dobrin. Someone will take you." That was Tuesday. Thursday came with sleet and an empty trail. Friday brought nothing but wind and the groaning of timber in the upper forest. By Saturday, the creek had swollen with meltwater from somewhere higher, and the trail was a ribbon of mud that would not hold a boot. His name was Marek. He was 16, broad across the shoulders from a year of hauling timber, narrow everywhere else from not enough meals. He had been hired as a camp hand for the autumn cutting season, sharpening saws, boiling water, stacking billets. At a wage so small, the men joked it was charity. When the supply caravan failed to return, and the crew abandoned the outpost early, no one thought to count him among the decisions that mattered. Marek did not follow the creek to Dobrin. He climbed higher. It was not bravery. He would say that later, many years later. It was not stubbornness, though he had plenty. From the logging clearing, the valley below looked like a closing mouth, gray clouds pressing down, the creek rising. But above, the ridge broke clean against the sky. He could see where the wind would break and where it would not. He could see a straight line of old stonework set into the cliff face like a dark tooth. He had noticed it weeks earlier while hauling water from the upper spring. A wall, not natural. Cut stone, fitted without mortar in the old way, half buried in scree. Someone had built something up there long ago, and the mountain had only partially reclaimed it. So he packed what little the crew had left behind: a hand axe, a coil of rope, a tin pot, a wool blanket with a burn hole in the center, a pouch of dried lentils, and half a block of hard cheese wrapped in cloth, and climbed. The route above the tree line took 3 hours. The last 100 yards were nearly vertical, a scramble over frost-slicked granite where the wind hit like a fist and didn't stop. His fingers were numb before he reached the top. His lips cracked. The air tasted thin and metallic, like licking an old coin. But the stonework was real. It was an old watch post, probably military, probably Austro-Hungarian, abandoned decades before the war. 3 walls of fitted stone, a partial roof of heavy slate, a chimney built into the cliff face. The 4th wall had collapsed outward. The roof had 2 large cracks. The chimney was clogged with birds' nests and calcium deposits. Wind poured through every gap. Marek set down his pack. He stood in the center of the ruin and turned, slowly, the way a man reads a letter for the second time. He saw what others would not have seen. The ridge curved north to south in a long arc, and the watchpost sat in the crook of that arc, on the eastern face. This meant the prevailing westerly winds, the ones that carried the worst weather, struck the back of the ridge and split around it, leaving the eastern face in a relative pocket of calm. The cliff behind the post was dark basalt, dense and heat-absorbent. Even now, in late afternoon with the sun already behind the peaks, the rock face radiated a faint warmth against his palm when he pressed his hand to it. Heat lingered here. The stone remembered the sun. He looked at the ruined walls, the broken chimney, the cracked roof. He looked at his hands, cut, calloused, young. He had a hand axe, some rope, and perhaps 12 days of food if he stretched it thin. "All right," he said aloud to no one. The wind swallowed the words immediately. He began. The first 3 days were ugly. He cleared the collapsed fourth wall stone by stone, stacking the usable pieces in order of size along the ledge. His back ached by the end of the first morning. By evening, his palms were bleeding through the calluses. He wrapped them in strips torn from the burn-holed blanket and kept working. The chimney was the priority. Without proper draft, a fire inside the shelter would fill it with smoke, and without fire, the nights above the tree line would be lethal within a week. He climbed onto the roof, carefully testing each slate slab before trusting his weight, and reached down into the flue with a stick, scraping out decades of calcium crust and the compressed remains of bird nests. Twice, chunks of it fell, and nearly knocked the stick from his grip. It took an entire day to clear the passage, but when he lit a small test fire that evening, using bark strips and the driest wood he could find below the tree line, the smoke rose, hesitated, and then pulled upward through the flue in a thin, steady column. He watched it disappear into the darkening sky and felt something unlock in his chest. Not joy, exactly. Something older. The satisfaction of a thing working the way it should. He sealed the wall gaps next. There was clay in a deposit 200 yards below the ledge, where a seasonal spring had cut into a bank of glacial till. He mixed it with wood ash from his fires, which he had read somewhere, or been told he couldn't remember which, made the mixture harder when it dried. He carried it up in the tin pot, load after load, and pressed it into every crack and seam he could reach. The work was slow and cold and monotonous, and his fingers stiffened so badly by the third load each day that he had to hold them over the fire for 10 minutes before he could grip the pot again. The fourth wall he rebuilt to half its original height, waist high, enough to block the wind at ground level where he would sleep. He couldn't lift the stones higher alone, so he stretched the wool blanket across the top of the gap as a windscreen anchored with rocks. It wasn't elegant. It worked. The roof cracks he could not fully repair. The slate slabs were too heavy to shift without a lever, and the ones that had cracked were cracked through. He laid pine boughs across the worst gaps and sealed the edges with clay, knowing it would not hold against heavy snow. It was the best he could manage. On the 5th day, he turned to the chimney wall. This was the idea that would matter. The basalt cliff behind the shelter absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly through the night. Marek had felt this, but the original builders had placed the fire pit against the opposite wall, the outer wall, where the heat simply bled into the wind. Every calorie of warmth they had generated had fought the cold and lost. Marek moved the fire pit. He cleared a space at the base of the cliff wall and built a new hearth from flat stones, setting it 18 inches out from the rock face. Behind it, between the fire and the cliff, he erected a low wall of stacked stone, angled slightly forward, like the reflector behind a lantern. When the fire burned, the radiant heat would strike this wall and bounce back into the shelter. Simultaneously, the cliff face behind would absorb the heat that passed through and release it for hours after the fire died down. He did not know the physics. He did not need to. He had watched blacksmiths angle their forge backs to throw heat toward the anvil. He had seen how a candle set before a mirror lit a room better than a candle alone. The principle was the same. Don't fight the cold. Redirect the warmth. That night, with a modest fire burning in the new hearth, the interior of the shelter held a temperature he estimated at 45 degrees, even as the ridge outside dropped below 20. He sat with his back against the warm cliff wall and ate lentils from the tin pot and felt, for the first time since Gruss had walked away, something close to safety. He carved a notch into the stone beside the doorway, one notch for each day. He would carve deeper ones when the temperature dropped hard enough to freeze the clay in his pot overnight. It was a rough thermometer, but it gave the days a shape, and shape was what kept panic at bay. Surviving was building. By the end of the second week, he had established routines that made survival repeatable. Mornings. Descend below the tree line to gather firewood. He learned which wood burned hot and which smoldered. Dense, resinous heartwood of dead spruce was best, but heavy. He began caching loads at intervals along the climb, so each trip moved fuel partway up. This system halved his effort per unit of fuel. Midday. Repair and improve the shelter. He extended the fourth wall another course of stone, dug a drainage trench around the perimeter, and carved a shelf into the cliff wall for his supplies. Afternoon. Forage. The pickings were sparse above the tree line. Rock lichens, alpine sorrel, the occasional cache of pine nuts raided from a squirrel's winter store. Below the tree line, there were rose hips, dried on the branch but rich with something that kept his gums from bleeding. He set simple snares along rabbit runs and caught one animal every 3 or 4 days. Enough protein to keep his muscles from wasting, though never enough to feel full. Evening. Maintain the fire, mend his clothes, and think. The thinking was important. Not brooding. Self-pity was a luxury the mountain would not permit, but active problem-solving. He kept a mental list of what wasn't working and revised it daily. The chimney drew well in calm conditions, but eddied smoke back into the shelter when the wind shifted to the north. He fixed this by extending the flue with a ring of flat stones that created a taller exit, raising the draft point above the wind shear line. The doorway, just an open gap in the rebuilt fourth wall, let heat escape. He wove a crude door from spruce boughs lashed to a frame of straight branches and hung it on rope hinges. It sagged and didn't seal perfectly, but it cut the heat loss by what he guessed was half. Water was the constant challenge. The nearest reliable source was the spring below the tree line, a 40-minute round trip. He began collecting frost and ice from the rocks each morning, melting it over the fire, which saved him 1 trip in 3. The mountain punished haste, but it rewarded attention. By the 3rd week, he had enough firewood cached for 5 days, enough dried rose hips and smoked rabbit to last 3, and a shelter that held its warmth through the night even when the fire burned to coals. His hands, though scarred and rough, had stopped bleeding. His breathing had adjusted to the thin air. He moved on the rocks with a sureness that hadn't been there before. He was not comfortable. Comfort was a word from lower elevations. But he was alive, and staying alive had become a system rather than a gamble. Then winter arrived 3 weeks early. The sky changed on a Tuesday. He knew because of the notches. The western horizon, which had been a clean line of peaks against pale blue, turned the color of a bruise. The wind, which had been steady from the west for days, died completely. The silence was enormous. Marek had never seen a mountain blizzard, but he had spent enough time watching the sky to know that sudden stillness before a storm was the mountain holding its breath before it screamed. He worked through the day with a focus that burned like fever. He hauled 3 extra loads of firewood up from the cache, stacking it inside until the space was halved. He packed snow and clay around the base of the walls, reinforced the bow door, and filled every container with water. He ate a full meal, the last of the cheese, lentils, smoked rabbit, knowing that rationing would begin tomorrow. The storm hit at dusk. It came not as wind, but as a wall. One moment the ridge was still. The next, the world dissolved into a horizontal torrent of white. The noise was not wind in any ordinary sense. It was a sustained roar, like standing inside a waterfall of ice. The temperature plummeted so fast that the clay between the stones cracked audibly, sharp pops like knuckles breaking. Marek pulled the bow door shut and wedged it with stones. He built the fire up high, higher than he usually allowed, risking sparks against the pine bough roof patches, and pressed his back against the warm cliff wall. The first night was endurable. The fire held. The walls held. The reflector wall threw heat back like a second fire. He slept in intervals, waking every hour to feed the flames. The second day was worse. Snow accumulated against the walls faster than the wind could scour it. By midday, the entrance was buried to the half wall, and the bow door bowed inward under the weight. He braced it with his firewood stack. Light disappeared. The shelter became a stone and snow coffin, lit only by fire. By the third morning, his firewood was down to a day's supply. He had been burning at twice the normal rate. The snow outside was chest deep at least. Then the chimney clogged. He smelled it before he saw it. A change in the smoke's behavior, from a clean upward draw to a lazy curl that spilled forward into the shelter. He looked up and saw the plume flatten against the ceiling and spread like fog. The flue, which he had extended with that ring of flat stones, had accumulated ice on the inside of the extension, condensation from the hot smoke meeting the frozen air, and the ice had built up until the opening was choked to a slit. Within 10 minutes, the shelter was thick with smoke. His eyes streamed. His lungs clenched. He dropped to the floor where the air was clearest, but even there, the smoke found him, acrid and heavy with resin. If he let the fire continue, the smoke would fill the space completely, and he would suffocate. If he put the fire out, the temperature would drop below zero within an hour, and without fuel to restart it, he would freeze. He killed the fire. He scattered the coals and smothered them with ash, and the darkness that followed was absolute. Not the darkness of a room with the lights off. The darkness of stone, of burial, of the inside of the earth. The only sound was the wind above, muffled by snow, and his own breathing, ragged, shallow, hot in his throat. He lay on the stone floor and pressed his face into the crook of his elbow and thought, very clearly, if I stay here, I die. The entrance was buried. The chimney was blocked. The fire was out. The temperature was falling and would not stop. He had to go outside. Getting out took 20 minutes. He dug upward through the snow that had packed against the bow door, using the tin pot as a shovel and his bare hands when the pot wasn't enough. The snow was dense, wind compressed, heavy as wet sand. It filled his collar and sleeves and packed against his skin, and the cold was so immediate and so total that his muscles locked for a moment, a full-body flinch that he had to override with conscious will. He broke through into the storm. The whiteout was not like fog. Fog has direction. It moves, it thins, it parts. The blizzard was a solid, moving mass that hit from every angle simultaneously. He could not see his hand at arm's length. He could not tell up from down. The wind tore at his clothing with the mindless persistence of water eroding stone. Within seconds, every exposed surface of his skin burned, then went numb. The chimney was above and behind the shelter, perhaps 12 feet up the cliff face, reachable by handholds he had used a dozen times in calm weather. In calm weather, it was a 30-second climb. Now, it was a death sentence misplaced by inches. The ledge was 6 feet wide. Beyond it, a 300-foot drop. In the whiteout, the edge was invisible. He pressed himself against the cliff wall and moved along it with his hands, feeling for familiar shapes. His fingers were beyond feeling. He gripped by will alone, trusting mechanics over sensation. The climb took 4 minutes. His foot slipped twice on iced holds, and each time he hung by his hands alone, legs swinging over nothing, the storm roaring like a living thing that wanted him gone. He reached the chimney top. He could feel the ring of extension stones and the ice. A thick collar, smooth and hard, narrowing the opening to a fist-width gap. He pulled the hand axe from his belt with fingers that could barely close and struck the ice with the flat of the blade. Once, twice. On the third strike, a section broke away and fell clattering down the flue. He kept striking, clearing the opening inch by inch until the wind caught the flue and roared through it. A sound like a giant inhaling, and the draft was clear. Getting down was worse. His hands were white and wooden. He descended by memory and gravity, sliding the last 5 feet and landing on the ledge in a heap. He lay there, face down in the snow, and felt the mountain's indifference like a physical weight. Then he crawled back inside. Rebuilding the fire was the hardest thing he had ever done. His hands would not obey. The bark shavings he kept in a dry pouch were damp from snow. He struck the flint against the axe blade 17 times before a spark caught. He bent over it, shielding it with useless hands, breathing so gently he feared the wrong exhale would kill the only warmth left in the world. It caught. He fed it splinters, then sticks, then split spruce heartwood, and the fire climbed back to life. The smoke rose, hesitated at the flue, and pulled cleanly upward into the storm. He built the fire up until the reflector wall glowed orange, then sat with his back against the warm stone and held his hands over the flames. The pain returned in waves, first tingling, then burning, then a deep ache that meant the tissue was alive. He did not sleep that night. He sat and fed the fire and watched the smoke draw cleanly and listened to the storm spend its fury against the ridge that curved around him like a cupped hand. By morning, the wind had dropped. By noon, the snow had settled enough that he could dig out the entrance properly. The sky was a pale, washed blue, the color of exhaustion, the color of survival. He carved a deep notch into the stone beside the doorway, deeper than any of the others. The rest of the winter was not easy, but it was not that night. He learned to pre-clear the chimney every evening before bed, reaching up into the flue with a stick and scraping the inner walls to prevent ice buildup. He learned to bank the fire lower and slower, producing less condensation in the flue while still keeping the shelter warm enough. He learned to read the snow for coming weather, the way it crystallized differently before a front, the way the wind shifted a full day before a storm arrived. He ate sparingly. The snares below the tree line still caught rabbits even in deep snow, and he supplemented with bark tea, an old forester's trick, stripping the inner bark of birch and boiling it, which tasted terrible and kept scurvy at a distance. He lost weight. His ribs showed, but his eyes stayed clear and his mind stayed sharp, and that was what the mountain required. In January, the deepest cold came. He recorded it in notches, 7 nights in a row when the clay in his pot froze solid, which he estimated at 10 below zero or worse. The fire burned constantly. The reflector wall saved him. Without it, the heat would have bled into the wind, and no amount of firewood would have kept the space livable. With it, the shelter held at something near freezing, even on the worst nights, cold enough to see his breath, warm enough to keep his blood moving. He passed the time by improving. He carved channels into the floor to direct meltwater away from his sleeping area. He built a drying rack above the fire for his rabbit skins, which he was slowly stitching into a second blanket with a bone needle and sinew thread. By February, the shelter was no longer a ruin. It was a home, not comfortable by any valley standard, but a home in the way the word really means, a place that holds your shape, that answers your needs because you have spent months learning its language. He had rebuilt the fourth wall to full height, using packed snow as scaffold. He had sealed the roof permanently with double-layered clay and flat stones. He had hung rabbit skins across the doorway and carved a ventilation slot with a sliding stone for airflow control. The shelter held 35 to 40 degrees inside on most winter nights. For a mountain above the tree line in the Carpathian winter, this was extraordinary. Spring came slowly, the way it does at altitude. Not a sudden greening, but a gradual retreat of white. The snow pulling back like a tide to reveal the dark rock and the first tentative patches of alpine grass. Marek had survived 147 days alone above the tree line. He knew the exact number because of the notches. He did not come down immediately. Over the winter, he had developed a relationship with the ridge that was difficult to explain. The mountain was not kind. It was not cruel. It was indifferent in the way that stone is indifferent. Absolutely, without malice, without mercy. And in that indifference, Marek had found a kind of honesty that human company had never offered. The mountain did not care that he was 16, or that he had been left behind. It cared only whether his walls were strong and his chimney drew clean. In late March, he descended to the tree line for the first time in weeks and found boot prints in the softening snow. 2 days later, voices carried up from below. A search party, or perhaps just foresters returning for the spring cutting season. They found him on the ledge, splitting firewood with the hand axe, thinner than they expected a living person to be, but steady, calm, and unmistakably alive. The men were from Dobrin. They had assumed he was dead. Gruss, the foreman, had reported him missing when the caravan failed. An avalanche had blocked the supply route, and by the time it was cleared, winter had sealed the upper mountain. No one had climbed above the tree line until now. They stared at the shelter, at the rebuilt walls, the functioning chimney, the reflector hearth, the ventilation system, the stacked firewood, the drying rack hung with rabbit skins. One of them, an older man named Petro, who had spent 40 years in the mountains, walked the perimeter slowly and said nothing for a long time. "You built this?" he asked finally. "I repaired it," Marek said. "It was here before me." Petro shook his head. "The walls were here. This," he gestured at the hearth, the reflector, the chimney extension, the drainage channels. "This you built." They offered to take him down. He said he would come, but not yet. There were things to finish. They looked at each other, this thin, quiet boy who spoke like a man twice his age, and left him supplies: salt, flour, a proper knife, a wool coat that fit. Marek stayed. The vindication came in April, though Marek did not think of it that way. A late-season storm, not as severe as the winter blizzard but violent enough, swept through the range while a team of government surveyors was mapping the upper ridges for a new forestry road. They were caught above the tree line with inadequate shelter and failing equipment. The wind drove them eastward along the ridge until they stumbled onto Marek's ledge. There were 5 of them, 3 surveyors, a guide, and a mule handler, in serious trouble. One had frostbitten hands, another showed signs of hypothermia, his speech slurred and coordination failing. Marek brought them inside. He built the fire high, angled for maximum heat off the reflector wall. He boiled water for the hypothermic man, warmed stones to pack around him, cleaned the frost-bitten hands with rabbit skin wraps. He fed them broth stretched with wild sorrel and lentils. The storm lasted 2 days. The chimney drew without fail. The walls held without a crack. The hypothermic surveyor recovered his speech by the second morning. When the storm broke, the lead surveyor, Horvath, educated in Vienna, sat across the fire from Marek. "How old are you?" 16, 17 in June. "This hearth design, who taught you this?" "No one. I watched where the heat went and put something in the way." Horvath wrote for a long time in his notebook. Before leaving, he told Marek the Forestry Commission was planning emergency shelters along the high routes, and that Marek's design was more effective than anything the Commission's engineers had proposed. "Would you be willing to consult?" he asked. "I don't know what that means," Marek said. "It means they pay you to teach them what you already know." Marek thought about Gruss, who had paid him almost nothing to carry water. He thought about the men who had walked down the mountain without looking back. "All right," he said. By the summer of 1924, Marek had helped the Commission site and design 4 emergency shelters along the Carpathian high routes. He was not an engineer. He could not read blueprints or calculate load-bearing capacities. But he could stand on a ridge and feel where the wind broke, and he could press his palm to a rock face and know whether it held heat or shed it. And he could look at a chimney and tell you whether the draft would fail in a north wind before a single fire was lit. The engineers learned to listen to him. Not all of them, and not immediately. A young architect from Budapest dismissed his input at the second site and placed the fire pit against the outer wall. The first winter storm dropped that shelter's temperature 15 degrees below the others. The Commission quietly rebuilt the hearth to Marek's specifications. Marek did not mention it. The mountain had taught him that being right was not a victory. It was just a fact, like the temperature or the wind direction. Over the following years, he trained others, young foresters, shepherds, guides, in the principles he had learned, not as formal lessons, but in the old way, by doing. He would take a boy to a ridge and say, "Put your hand on the rock. Feel the difference? That's where you build." He married at 23. Her name was Lena, a forester's daughter from the valley below Dobrin, practical and calm and entirely unimpressed by the reputation that had begun to follow him. She had her own competence. She could read weather better than he could, and she kept a garden at altitude that everyone said was impossible. "You just have to listen to the dirt," she told him once, and he recognized the principle immediately. Attention, patience, working with what the world was already doing. They raised 3 children on the ridge above Dobrin, in a house that Marek built with his own hands. It had a reflector hearth. It had a chimney that drew clean in any wind. It had walls 2 feet thick and a ventilation system that kept the air fresh without losing heat. People came to learn. Marek taught anyone who asked, and he never charged for it. The knowledge was not his, he said. He had borrowed it from the mountain. Marek Holub died in the winter of 1979, at the age of 72, in the house on the ridge above Dobrin. The chimney drew clean. The reflector wall glowed with stored heat. Lena had passed 3 years before, and it was his youngest daughter, Anna, who sat with him at the end. He had been lucid until the last day. That morning, he had asked Anna to open the ventilation slot, and the cold mountain air had come in, sharp and clean, carrying the smell of snow and stone and spruce. the smell of everything he had ever known. "Is there anything you need?" Anna asked. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "No, everything is where I put it." He closed his eyes. Outside, the wind moved along the ridge the way it always had, splitting against the curved rock, eddying past the chimney, pressing against the walls that held. Somewhere below, in the spruce forest, a branch cracked under the weight of new snow, and the sound carried upward, clear and small, into the enormous silence of the mountain. 11 of Marek Holub's emergency shelters still stand along the Carpathian high routes today, maintained by the Regional Forestry Service. The reflector hearth design he developed at 16 has been incorporated into mountain shelter construction guides across Central Europe, often without attribution. His field journal, the notched door frame of the original watch post, preserved when the site was designated a historical landmark in 1968, remains the most detailed record of winter temperatures on the Upper Tisa Ridge for the 1920s. Anna Holub became a structural engineer. Her eldest son became a mountain guide. His daughter teaches alpine ecology at the university in Uzhhorod. Each carries the same principle. A 16-year-old boy learned alone on a frozen ridge in 1923. Pay attention. The mountain is already telling you what it needs. Put your hand on the stone. Feel where the warmth lingers. Build there. There is always more to find.